Man-made disaster, on Iran shooting down Ukraine plane, The Hindu. The shooting down of a passenger plane by Iran's military on Wednesday, a few hours after it launched missile attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, is the most tragic outcome of the recent spike in U.S.-Iran tensions. The Ukrainian jet with 176 aboard was hit by an Iranian surface-to-air missile shortly after it took off from Tehran's Imam Khomeini airport. After initially rejecting Western assertion that an Iranian missile brought down the plane, Tehran on Saturday said one of its soldiers fired the missile, mistaking the jet for an enemy aircraft, as it turned to a sensitive area. This is not the first time U.S.-Iran tensions have led to an aviation disaster. In 1988, in the last stage of the Iran-Iraq War, a U.S. Navy warship shot down an Iran air flight over the Gulf, killing all 290 passengers. Then the U.S. troops said they mistook the plane for a military aircraft that was going to attack the ship. Iran says the same today. In both incidents, innocents, who did not have anything to do with the conflict, became victims. This time it was U.S. President Donald Trump's reckless decision to assassinate Soleimani that pushed both countries to the brink of a war. After launching missiles at U.S. troops in Iraq in retaliation for the general's killing, Iran's missile defense systems were on high alert, anticipating retaliatory American airstrikes. Iran blames human error for the attack on the passenger plane. But whatever the context is, it cannot abdicate responsibility for what happened. Ukraine International Airlines says the flight took off after clearance from the airport. The airline also rejects the Iranian military's claim that the plane veered off its route. Iran's admission and apology is a step in the right direction. But it should carry out, along with international investigators, a thorough probe into what led to the accident, and punish whoever is responsible for the human error. Such mistakes are unacceptable even in war. Iran should have put in place the highest safety measures and followed international protocols while preparing itself for enemy retaliation. Clearly it did not do so. And innocent people paid a price for Iran's mistake. Both Iran and the U.S. should also ask themselves whether the confrontational path they have chosen since Mr. Trump unilaterally pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, in May 2018, was worth the risk. Both countries were on the brink of an all-out war early this week. At least 226 people, mostly Iranians, have already lost their lives in tragedies related to the Soleimani killing. Over 50 were killed in a stampede at the funeral. If Iran is sincere in its apology, it should not only unearth what happened and punish the culprits but also take immediate steps to reduce tensions with the U.S. Matter of interpretation, on NCRB's Crime in India Report 2018. The Hindu. Only 3 months after the release of the much-delayed Crime in India report for 2017, the National Crime Records Bureau's 2018 report was unveiled last week. While the fact that this document has been made available so soon should be welcomed, this report, as with those for earlier years, carries the caveat that crime records and statistics are only as good as their reporting. Some states are better than others in tracking and registering crimes. This is why Kerala and the National Capital Region having the highest crime rates in the country, 1,463.2 per 1 lakh population and 1,342.5 respectively, is also a reflection of the fact that crime reporting, follow-up and subsequent steps in trial and punishment are much better undertaken in these two states, UTs. Yet, what should be worrying for the capital city region is that unlike Kerala, the number of cognizable crimes has steadily increased to 262,612 in 2018 from 216,920 in 2016. Better reporting could also perhaps explain why there is a 15% increase in the total crimes against women across all states, but the fact that this number went up by 66% in a large state such as Uttar Pradesh must be cause for concern. Conversely, crimes against women fell 20.8% after reaching a peak number of 17,222 in Delhi. It is well understood that the protests against the gang rape in Delhi in 2012 had significantly contributed to greater reporting of crimes against women. The fall in these numbers, corresponding to the general increase in crimes, could reflect the outcomes of better gender sensitization in the capital region. Unlike crime numbers that are difficult to interpret due to registration and policing issues, the number of murders across states is a stark reflection of violent crime. The finding in the 2017 NCRB report that northeastern states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Tripura and Meghalaya have a relatively higher murder rate compared to most states bears itself out in 2018 as well. Other states which have a worrisome record here include Jharkhand, 4.6 murders per 1 lakh population, the highest in the country, and Haryana, 3.9. Among cities, Patna, 4.4, has an egregious murder rate. Also read: Decoding NCRB report. While protests and violence related to them have occupied the news cycle in the last month or so, data from the report suggest that there has been a marginal decrease in the total cases related to rioting from 2016, 61,974, to 2018, 57,828. Cases related to caste and communal, religious riots, political violence and agrarian conflicts registered a dip while there was an increase in industrial rioting and other personal disputes. Among cases registered as offenses against the state, there has been an ominous increase under sedition, with the number of those booked in 2018 double that of 2016, even as most such cases under this section came under the Prevention of Damage of Public Property Act. Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh led with nearly half of the overall cases. Remote Control, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 13, 2022, hours 24 minutes and 31 seconds am. The government must take care not to stall the new industry on takeoff by excessive or arbitrary regulation, which is often encouraged by diffuse anxieties. Drone attacks in Saudi Arabia and Iraq have raised concerns among Indian security agencies, and the government is tightening the regulatory grip on the infant sector. The newly launched Digital Sky platform, a registration portal for manufacturers and operators on the lines of the one operated by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration (FAA), is likely to introduce more stringent requirements. The fears are not misplaced, since drones constitute a new means of surveillance and a novel attack vector, and must coexist with civil aviation safety requirements, besides military and public security imperatives. However, the government must take care not to stall the new industry on takeoff by excessive or arbitrary regulation, which is often encouraged by diffuse anxieties. Drones constitute a broad-spectrum enabling technology which could open up or broaden several sectors. While e-commerce platforms and fast food companies would like to use drones to service urban addresses like high-rise apartments more cost-effectively, development and environment agencies would use them to supply medicines in remote mountain areas, or to deliver seeds to reforest such regions. Drones bear comparison with communications and the Internet, enabling technologies which have powered unprecedented growth across sectors as distinct as tourism and disaster management. However, communications remained government-controlled until the mid-90s because of security considerations, and spectrum was held exclusively by the government and the military. Recently, the opening up of retail and e-commerce has been needlessly slow and granular because of concerns about the economic security of traditional retail. It turned out that the fears were exaggerated. Retail as a whole benefited from the enlargement of the marketplace, and traditional sellers and distribution networks integrated quickly with e-commerce. Genetically modified Bt brinjal demonstrated a different phenomenon: politicization of the question of safety, conflated with concerns about intellectual property rights, caused regulation to be applied arbitrarily. The apparent trigger for India's concern about drone policy is the killing of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani. But in our region, historically, a fully loaded garland or a case of exploding mangoes has always been preferred over high technology. Other considerations of public security do demand consideration, though. The proposed restrictions are roughly on the lines of recent drone regulation under the FAA in the U.S. But the government should assess threat perceptions logically, and not expand on the theme of security without good cause. Think long-term. The Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 13, 2022, hours 19 minutes and 45 seconds am. Far from projecting an imminent V-shaped recovery, the budget should be conservative in its growth and revenue assumptions, while coming clean on the actual deficit numbers. Even as the next union budget is hardly 3 weeks away, one thing is clear: there's not much it can do to spur an economic recovery in the immediate term. The reason for that isn't just the limited fiscal and monetary space available for stepping up government spending, without putting public debt sustainability at risk, or further slashing interest rates, in a scenario of rising inflation expectations from higher food and fuel prices. But equally important is the state of private investment. Only a handful of Indian corporates today are really in a position to infuse promoters' equity in big-ticket projects costing, say, 10,000 crore rupees or more. Nor are there many banks willing to finance the debt portion. This story, lack of confidence, if not ability, among both promoters and lenders, is the opposite of what it was during the investment boom of 2004-2011. And when consumers, too, are feeling the pinch and not opening their wallets, it adds to an overall dismal picture. In short, far from projecting an imminent V-shaped recovery, the budget should be conservative in its growth and revenue assumptions, while coming clean on the actual deficit numbers. These would mean providing fully for unpaid food and fertilizer subsidy dues, not resorting to off-balance sheet expenditures through borrowings forced on the likes of National Highway Authority of India, Power Finance Corporation and Indian Railway Finance Corporation, and moving from a cash to accrual-based accounting of revenues and expenditures. Greater accounting transparency, along with focusing on the revenue as opposed to fiscal deficit, will do a lot to inspire market confidence. For investors, what matters is not the headline deficits as unhelpful combativeness on concerns about CAA, The Hindu. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's statement that the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, or CAA 2019, intended only to grant citizenship to a certain class of people, and not to deny citizenship to anyone is factually accurate. But his extrapolation that hence the Act's critics are misinformed is unfounded and misleading. The concern expressed by many is not that it allows citizenship to people escaping persecution from neighboring countries. On the contrary, the fundamental opposition to the law is that it does so in a discriminatory and inadequate manner. The CAA introduces a religious test in classifying victims of persecution, and granting them citizenship in a secular republic. The one strand of opposition, among indigenous communities in the northeastern states, is indeed against granting citizenship rights to anyone, regardless of religion. Mr. Modi appeared to be eager to pacify them, as he should be, by reiterating that safeguards are being included in the law to protect the cultural and linguistic rights of indigenous groups. When it comes to addressing the legitimate and well-founded concerns of constitutional experts, the opposition and several state governments, he tends to turn unhelpfully combative. If Mr. Modi and his colleagues are genuinely concerned that there is misinformation, they must reach out to the critics rather than disparage them. Instead, party functionaries have latched onto the situation as yet another opportunity for political propaganda, a communal one at that, and launched a marathon monologue. If the CAA's provisions reflect the BJP's Hindutva philosophy, the straw man argument further accentuates it. The suggestion is that the CAA's opponents are opposed to giving refuge to persecuted Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, and Christian minorities from Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bangladesh, which they are not. The CAA's rationale is that these countries have a state religion, and religious minorities face persecution. But persecution need not be only religious in nature. In Sri Lanka, Tamils have suffered in the hands of the establishment and the dominant Sinhalas. Moreover, Islamic sects, Shias and Ahmadiyas, and non-believers that have come under attack in these three countries are denied the benefit under the CAA for no logical reason. The explanation that the current CAA is only remedying a grievance left over by partition is unconvincing. Afghan refugees should not have qualified by that reasoning. In truth, the popular suspicion of the government's intent draws from its political rhetoric and the link between a national register of Indian citizens and the CAA that its functionaries repeatedly seek to forge. Critics have laid out their concerns regarding the CAA. It is the government that needs to explain its position. By repeatedly misinterpreting the concerns, the government betrays an unwillingness to engage on the issue. Vote for status quo, on ruling parties win in Taiwan, The Hindu. Taiwan's pro-democracy president Tsai Ing-wen's re-election, with a record mandate since the country's first direct elections of 1996, could further strain ties with China. Ms. Tsai's Democratic Progressive Party (DPP) suffered major losses in the 2018 local elections, but on Saturday, she took over 57% of the vote against her challenger, Han Kuo-yu of the Kuomintang Party, which once ruled in China before moving to Taiwan. Opposition to Beijing's one country two systems policy has long defined the ruling DPP. The Hong Kong protests have only served to bring into sharp relief the consolidation of democracy and sovereignty in Taiwan ahead of the weekend's elections. Indeed, the opposition's landslide victory in Hong Kong's local elections in November added momentum to Ms. Tsai's own prospects. In a campaign marred by allegations of Chinese fake news and social media trolls on DPP candidates, she was subject to attacks on the authenticity of her degree from the London School of Economics, which the latter has confirmed. Also, the ruling party's consolidation has coincided with the emergence of an assertive China, and with attempts of U.S. President Trump to use Taipei as a bargaining chip in his trade war with China. Taiwan's future remains unfinished business for China's President Xi Jinping, who, in October, presided over the 70th anniversary of the revolution. He has in the recent past declared his intention to use force to unify Taiwan with the mainland. For his part, Mr. Trump departed from protocol after his election when he received Ms. Xi's congratulatory call. Recent U.S. legislation to promote Taipei relations did not go down well in Beijing. China has meanwhile leveraged its economic clout to influence much of Africa and Latin America to withhold recognition to Taiwan as a sovereign state. According formal recognition to the island nation's official name, the Republic of China, is among the DPP's conditions for initiating dialogue with Beijing. A ratcheting of the rhetoric by Taipei and Beijing is more likely now. But it is unlikely that Mr. Xi would want to risk global recrimination from any aggressive military display either against Taiwan or Hong Kong. Taiwan's zealous defense of its market economy and democratic freedoms may not seem compatible with the China model of state-sponsored capitalism and one-party rule. Yet, it may not be too fanciful to imagine the establishment of a possible modus vivendi, built on the mutual interest on either side to maintain the operation of market forces. A resolution of the historic dispute could be long drawn. But a constructive and democratic international response would be for the big powers to desist from exploiting the situation to promote their own interests. The Cost of Subsidy, The Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 14, 2020 10 hours 42 minutes and 45 seconds am. The existing system is heavily biased in favor of two cereal crops, procured mainly from farmers having assured irrigation access. In April 1983, N.T. Rama Rao's government in Andhra Pradesh launched a 2 rupees per kilogram rice scheme considered highly populist for that time. What would one, then, say of such a scheme replicated on a national scale, supplying 25 kilograms of wheat or rice per month at Rs 2/3 of a per kilogram even today to 3/4 of India's rural and half of its urban population? Given the economic cost of over 25 rupees for the Food Corporation of India (FCI) to procure, store and distribute a kilogram of wheat and Rs 36 per kilograms for rice, the annual losses on nearly 60 million tons (MT) of subsidized grain sales under the so-called National Food Security Act of 2013 (NFSA) are huge. But the distortion does not stop at supplying grain at prices frozen in time. It also extends to open-ended government procurement at minimum support prices, MSP, hiked year after year. The result, a central food subsidy bill budgeted at 1 rupee, 84,220 crore for 2019-20 in the FCI's rice and wheat stocks of 56.5 MT is on January 1 being way above the required 21.4 MT for this date, even after providing for the NFSA. This is clearly unsustainable. The Narendra Modi government, as this newspaper has reported, is attempting rationalization of food subsidy by making sure that the MSP payments are firstly going not to market intermediaries, but to actual farmers by transferring the money directly into the latter's bank accounts. This complements efforts at seeding of the odd numbers of NFSA beneficiaries with their ration cards. The whole approach here is to curb leakages of MSP benefits to non-farmers and that of NFSA to those who would simply divert the super-subsidized grain to the open market. Once a proper database of both farmers and NFSA consumers is built, a further targeting, limiting MSP-based procurement to only smallholders and supplying subsidized grains to the genuinely poor, who will be less than the current roughly 2/3 of all households, becomes possible. But such measures merely nibble away at what is a most inefficient, market-distorting and fiscally costly way of helping farmers and poor consumers. The existing system is heavily biased in favor of two cereal crops, procured mainly from farmers having assured irrigation access. The interest of vulnerable consumers is best secured by the government making direct cash transfers and simultaneously building a buffer stock of all essential commodities, rice, wheat, pulses, edible oils, milk powder, butter, fat and onions, that would enable effective market intervention. Such operations, in order to avoid excessive price volatility, do not require maintaining 60 to 70 mt of stocks. The Modi government can similarly do more for farmers, including those growing crops other than paddy and wheat, by expanding the scope of the PM Kisan Direct Income Support Scheme. That will cost less and deliver better than the ₹2 82,000 crore spent every year on the food, fertilizer and farm credit subsidy. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Tags: Andhra Pradesh, Narendra Modi. 0 comments asterisk. The moderation of comments is automated and not cleared manually by IndianExpress.com. Don't stop the music, the Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 14, 2020, 10 hours 42 minutes and 27 seconds am. The national anthem will no more be sung in Tamil, the second official language of the country, at the February 4 National Day ceremony. Days after he was elected, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa declared that even though the Tamil and Muslim communities had not voted for him, he was the president of all Sri Lankan people. He is yet to provide any confidence that that inclusive spirit will inform his governance. To begin with, he included no Muslims, and only 2 Tamils in his 51-member cabinet. It has no women either. He made his intentions even clearer in his inaugural speech in Parliament on January 3. We must always respect the aspirations of the majority of the people. I will always defend the unitary status of our country, and protect and nurture the Buddha Sasana whilst safeguarding the right of all citizens to practice a religion of their choice. The majority in Sri Lanka are the Sinhala Buddhist people, on whose votes Gotabaya was elected. The Tamil minority has been struggling for years for the adoption of constitutional amendments that will loosen the unitary grip and address its political aspirations, but that looks farther away now. The government has lost no time in pandering to the majoritarian galleries. The national anthem will no more be sung in Tamil, the second official language of the country, at the February 4 National Day ceremony. The practice had been initiated in 2016 by the previous National Unity Government, as a measure of inclusiveness, and in recognition of the need for national reconciliation. It had symbolic value, coming as it did after an era in which the predecessor Mahinda Rajapaksa government had engendered a toxic mix of Sinhala nationalism and militarism on the back of the 2009 military victory over the LTTE. In fact, it was the Mahinda Rajapaksa government that unofficially discouraged and ended the singing of the official Tamil translation of the anthem at government functions and in schools in the Tamil north and east of the country, which had been common practice since the 1950s. Some in Sri Lanka have pointed to India, where the anthem is sung in one language across the country. The two situations are not comparable. Post-independence India quickly adopted a path towards accommodation of its linguistic diversity, and barring a few years in the 1950s, language has consequently not been the inflammable issue that it became in Sri Lanka. No home for koalas, the Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 14, 2020, 10 hours 42 minutes and 14 seconds am. The fire has claimed thousands of koalas in Australia's forests, at least half of the animals in Kangaroo Island Sanctuary, a key insurance for its future, are feared dead. Among the several heart-rending images from the bush fires sweeping through Australia's forests is that of a koala clutching at a bottle of water offered by firefighters. The animal in the image is amongst the lucky few that escaped the inferno, clinging to rescuers. The fire has claimed thousands of koalas in Australia's forests, at least half of the animals in Kangaroo Island Sanctuary, a key insurance for its future, are feared dead. The much-loved marsupial is currently categorized as vulnerable in Australia. But with 30% of the koala habitat being ravaged by fires, the Australian government is reportedly contemplating declaring the country's iconic animal as endangered. The koala has a long history of being misunderstood by humans. Confounded by the richness of Australasia's animal kingdom, early 19th century European naturalists debated whether the furry-eyed, spoony-nosed arboreal creature was a sloth or a monkey and pronounced it as Phascolarctos cinereus, or the pouch-bearing ash-colored bear. The animal actually shares much more with the kangaroo and the wombat. The errors in taxonomy were, however, benign compared to what the koalas faced when European settlers made their home in Australia. At least 8 million koalas were killed and their pelts were shipped to London and cities in the US and Canada between 1880 and 1920. In the second half of the 20th century, koala tourism reimagined the marsupial as a cute creature on the lookout for human affection. But recent research has shown that in their natural habitats, koalas are shy creatures who prefer to be left alone on eucalyptus trees. The trees are among the most fire-adapted vegetation on Earth. The trouble, however, is that during times of climate change they do not offer sanctuary for the koala. Theological thicket, on SC's hearing in Sabarimala temple case, the Hindu. The opening hearing before a 9-judge Supreme Court bench, constituted to give an authoritative pronouncement on the nature of religious freedom under the Constitution, has revealed the conceptual confusion over the reference made to it. The bench, headed by the Chief Justice of India, S.A. Bobde, has asked lawyers to reframe the issues, or add to them, following submissions that the questions framed by a bench of 5 judges were too broad. Further, the CJI has clarified that the court will not be deciding the petitions seeking a review of the verdict in the Sabarimala temple case. Instead, it would limit itself to larger questions, such as the interplay between freedom of religion and other fundamental rights, and the extent to which courts can probe whether a particular practice is essential to that religion or not. At the same time, he has said, we will decide questions of law on women's entry into mosques, temples, genital mutilation among Dawoodi Bohras, entry of Parsi women who marry outside the community into the fire temple. We will not decide the individual facts of each case. It would be prudent if this approach means that the bench would set out the limits of the freedom of religion, against which such practices can be tested and their legality determined. However, it would be unwise if the examination of every discriminatory practice becomes a fresh treatise on Articles 25 and 26, instead of being subjected to a simple test whether the particular practice is protected by the freedom of religion, or can be curbed on the grounds of public order, morality and health. A signal flaw in the reference is that it did not emanate from benches before which these matters were pending. Normally, such issues are referred to a larger bench only if the court is faced with apparently contradictory precedents, or feels that the settled law requires reconsideration. A 5-judge bench, while hearing the Sabarimala review petitions, had referred a set of questions to a larger bench. But 2 dissenting judges had pointed out that it was up to benches before which such cases came up to decide whether they should go by existing precedent, or refer the matter to larger benches for fresh consideration. That the strength of the bench was fixed at 9 may indicate that the court is leaving scope for revisiting the 1954 7-judge bench decision in the Shiror Mutt case, holding that religious denominations had the autonomy to decide what religious practices were essential to them. A reconsideration of this essentiality doctrine will be useful only if it is a means to rid the court of the burden of entering the theological thicket. However, even without revisiting the judgment, courts have often given verdicts that protect individual rights, and uphold equality and dignity over regressive religious practices. Inflation shocker, on rise of consumer price inflation, The Hindu. The inflation devil is back and at the wrong time. The 7.35% rise in consumer price inflation in December is a shocker even to those who were prepared for an elevated level of inflation in the backdrop of the rise in prices of food commodities in general, and the astronomical rise in the price of onions, in particular. The disturbing December print has set off fears over whether India is entering a period of slow growth accompanied by high inflation, in other words, stagflation. Such fears have to be weighed against a few facts. First, the headline inflation number is driven mainly by food inflation at 14.12%, it was 10.01% in November and -2.65% in December 2018. While onion was the prime villain pushing up price inflation in vegetables to a huge 60.50% compared to December 2018, prices of other food items such as meat and fish, up 9.57%, milk, up 4.22%, eggs, up 8.79%, and some pulses were also on the upswing. These are a largely seasonal rise in prices and are driven mainly by supply-side factors, and the prices will reverse once the supply shortfall is addressed. An analysis by State Bank of India's research team shows that minus the increase in prices of onion, potato and ginger, headline CPI inflation would be just 4.48%. Second, core inflation, which is the one that should be of concern, has only inched up marginally from 3.5% in November to 3.7% in December. That said, it would be worrisome indeed if core inflation were to shoot up or if food inflation does not cool down in the next couple of months. Also, the effects of the increase in telecom tariffs, rail tickets and in fuel prices need to be closely watched. The sharp jump in the CPI has queered the pitch for the Reserve Bank of India's monetary policy review in February. The central bank stood pat on rates in the December policy precisely due to fears of inflation and had even revised upwards its inflation projection for the second half of the fiscal to 4.7–5.1%. The December print is way above the Monetary Policy Committee's (MPC) mandated limit of 6%, 4% plus 2%, which means that a rate cut is pretty much off the table for now. Yet, with growth sagging, there is pressure on the central bank to cut rates at least one more time to stimulate growth. It would be interesting to watch the deliberations of the MPC in February. While the market may be prepared to accept a standstill policy for now, any change in the RBI's stance from accommodative to neutral may not go down well. A lot would also depend on the fiscal arithmetic that would emerge from the budget to be presented on February 1st. Meanwhile, the government should engage all levers to address the supply-side issues that are behind the rise in food inflation. A calming down of food prices will help the bank do what the government and markets want: lower rates. Before school, the Indian Express. Published, January 15, 2024 hours 5 minutes and 39 seconds am. More than 20% of students in Standard I are less than 6, as our 2019 reveals. They should ideally be in preschool. At the same time, 36% students in Standard I are older than the RTE mandated age of 6. Since 2005, the NGO Pratham's annual Status of Education reports, (ASER), have shone a light on a critical failure of India's education system. A large number of school-going children across the country are short on basic learning skills. These reports have led to debates on seminal policy interventions such as the Right to Education Act and have been catalysts for meaningful conversations on the pedagogical deficiencies of the formal school system. The latest edition of ASER, released on Tuesday, directs attention to children between 4 and 8 years of age, and suggests that India's learning crisis could be linked to the weakness of the country's pre-primary system. More than 20% of students in Standard I are less than 6, ASER 2019 reveals. They should ideally be in preschool. At the same time, 36% students in Standard 1 are older than the RTE mandated age of 6. Even within Standard I, children's performance on cognitive, early language, early numeracy, and social and emotional learning tasks is strongly related to their age. Older children do better on all tasks, the report says. This is a significant finding and should be the starting point for a substantive debate on the ideal entry-level age to primary school. In this context, policymakers would also do well to go back to the pedagogical axiom which underlines that children between 4 and 8 are best taught cognitive skills through play-based activities. The emphasis, as ASER 2019 emphasizes, should be on developing problem-solving faculties and building memory of children, and not content knowledge. ASER 2019 talks about leveraging the existing network of Anganwadi centers to implement school readiness. The core structure of the Anganwadis was developed more than 40 years ago as part of the Integrated Child Development Scheme, ICDS. Preschool education is part of their mandate. But at the best of times, these centers do no more than implement the government's child nutrition schemes. A number of health crises, including last year's AES outbreak in Bihar, have bared the inadequacies of the system. A growing body of scholarly work has also shown that the Anganwadi worker is poorly paid, demoralized and lacks the autonomy to be an effective nurturer. The ASER report is alive to such shortcomings. There is a need to expand and upgrade Anganwadis to ensure that children get adequate and correct educational inputs of the kind that are not modeled after the formal school, it notes. The government would do well to act on this recommendation, especially since the draft education policy that was put up for public discussion last year also stresses on the preschool system. A rough patch, The Indian Express. Published, January 15, 2024 hours 0 minutes and 42 seconds am. Food inflation has risen to a near 6-year high of 14.12% in December 2019, up from 10.01% in the previous month. Latest inflation data seems to corroborate fears articulated by the Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, in its December meeting when it refrained from cutting the benchmark repo rate. Retail inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index (CPI), has surged to 7.35% in December 2019, up from 5.54% in November, according to data from the National Statistical Office. With headline inflation well above the RBI's upper bound target of 6%, it is expected to remain elevated in the coming months, may well surpass the RBI's estimate for the second half of this fiscal year. It reduces the space for further easing of policy rates, even after clarity over the extent of the center's fiscal slippage emerges. The 10-year G-Sec yields have reacted sharply to these developments, rising to 6.67 on Tuesday, partially offsetting the impact of the RBI's recent open market operations. This combination of weak economic activity and higher-than-expected supply-side inflationary pressures has put the inflation targeting regime under test. Much of the rise in the headline inflation number can be traced to higher food prices. Food inflation has risen to a near 6-year high of 14.12% in December 2019, up from 10.01% in the previous month. Much of this spurt is due to vegetable prices, which have surged to 60.5% in December, contributing nearly 3.7 percentage points to the headline numbers. Prior to this data, there was an argument for overlooking this spurt in food prices, and easing rates further, as this spike in inflation is likely to be transitory. but the price rise has been much more pronounced. And while vegetable crop cycles tend to be short, and supply-side pressures may ease in the coming months, the stickiness in prices slow connection, the Indian Express. Published, January 16, 2024 hours 5 minutes and 7 seconds am. Institutions and offices must monitor Internet usage, record users and change access credentials every day. In response to a Supreme Court ruling last week, the central government is restoring broadband connections to government installations and providers of essential services, hospitals, banks and the tourism sector in Jammu and Kashmir. However, the step falls far short of the complete withdrawal of curbs on public communications which the court had sought. ISPs are required to block social media sites and technology by which such a restriction can be bypassed, before providing access to institutions and essential service providers. Institutions and offices must monitor Internet usage, record users and change access credentials every day. A call will be taken on fully opening up mobile data communications after the Republic Day celebrations, the government says. This is far too tentative, considering the spectrum of fundamental rights that have been violated by the Internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir, which is the longest ever in a democracy. Last week, responding to petitions by Kashmir Times executive editor Anuradha Bhasin and Congressman Ghulam Nabi Azad, the Supreme Court had ruled that the Internet shutdown was in violation of Article 19(1)(a) and Article 19(1)(g), which confer the freedom of speech and expression, and the freedom to practice any profession or occupation, and to operate a business, anywhere in the territory of India. Any curb on public freedoms instituted by the government must be constitutional and proportionate. The Internet shutdown fails on the question of proportionality because it is of unspecified duration. Communications may be restricted for very short periods in the interest of public safety, but here, there is an absence of a declared cutoff date. Moreover, this shutdown has demonstrated, like never before, that the Internet has become the backbone of normal life. Not only has the suspension of data services curtailed the freedom of speech, it has also exacted business losses in the range of 18,000 crore rupees, according to the Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industries, which had welcomed the SC ruling as an opportunity to seek compensation. In addition, commonplace actions like seeking medical advice and filing examination and job applications had become impossible or extraordinarily difficult. The SC ruling was forward-looking, placing all communications shutdowns under the watch of the court. Judicial oversight would encourage governments to be less arbitrary in the future, for they would have to pass the proportionality test. The inevitability of large compensation claims, in the event of failing the test, would serve as a material deterrent. Power Replay, The Indian Express. Published, January 16, 2024 hours 10 minutes and 5 seconds am. Under Uday, Discoms were to bring down AT&C losses to 15% by FY19. Almost 5 years after the launch of the Ujjwal Discom Assurance Yojana, Uday, there are indications that the power sector is once again in trouble. Not only have losses of state-owned distribution companies Discoms risen, but their dues for power purchases have also surged. At the end of November 2019, dues owed by Discoms to power producers, both independent and state-run entities, stood at 80,930 crore rupees. Of these, 71,673 crore rupees extends beyond the allowed grace period of 60 days. Rajasthan leads the states with the most dues, followed by Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh. These numbers suggest that, contrary to expectations, the Uday scheme has failed to engineer a sustainable turnaround in the fortunes of the beleaguered distribution segment, the weakest link in the power chain. Reportedly, the center is contemplating yet another scheme to address the issues that continue to plague the sector. But, as distribution falls under the purview of states, rather than adopting an approach similar to that of the past schemes, the new scheme should focus on altering the incentive structure at the state level so as to ensure the achievement of targets. The Uday scheme, which involved state governments taking over the debt of Discoms, had three critical components: a reduction in the aggregate technical and commercial (AT&C) losses, timely revision of tariffs, and elimination of the gap between average per unit of cost and revenue realized. While progress has been made on some of these fronts, it hasn't been in line with the targets laid out under Uday. AT&C losses have declined in some states, but not to the extent envisaged. Under Uday, Discoms were to bring down AT&C losses to 15% by FY19. Similarly, while some states have raised power tariffs, the hikes have not been sufficient as political considerations prevailed over commercial decisions. As a result, the gap between the average cost per unit of power and the revenue realized has not declined in the manner envisaged, forcing Discoms to reduce their power purchases and delay payments to power producers. This in turn has impaired the ability of power-generating companies to service their debt, causing stress to the banking sector. The new plan, reportedly, aims to address these issues by reducing electricity losses, eliminating the tariff gap, smart metering, privatizing Discoms, and having distribution franchisees. These would be welcome measures. But, along with these, the center should also look at altering the incentive structures of states in order to ensure compliance. Stiff penalties need to be imposed for not meeting the targets laid out in the new scheme. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Take care, Diego, the Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 16, 2020, 10 hours 26 minutes and 44 seconds am. When Diego was brought in from a zoo in San Diego, the ecological integrity of the islands was threatened. Not much is known about his pre-Galapagos life. In 1976, when Diego landed on the Galapagos Islands, his fellow Espanola giant tortoises faced extinction. There were just 14 of his kind in the wild, 12 of them female. In a little more than 40 years, Diego sired more than 800 Espanola tortoises and, along with his mates, helped mitigate the crisis of his species. Galapagos today is home to more than 2,000 Espanola tortoises. And Diego can now retire from the island's captive breeding program, a poster boy of conservation. In the mid-20th century, Galapagos's giant tortoises were hunted by sailors and whalers for food. The sailors also introduced goats to the islands that depleted cacti, food, water and shade for the giant tortoise. When Diego was brought in from a zoo in San Diego, the ecological integrity of the islands was threatened. Not much is known about his pre-Galapagos life. Estimates about his age vary. One thing we do know for sure, his sojourn at Galapagos established Diego as unique to his species. The Espanol tortoise is known to be shy and reserved. Diego, however, wasn't just a playboy. There are accounts aplenty of the long-necked, yellow-faced tortoise looking warmly at tourists. A fundamental tenet of evolution is that adaptability holds the key to species survival. At Galapagos, Charles Darwin's famous observatory, Diego seems to have vindicated the sage of evolution. There are worries that with limited genes, the Espanol tortoise's revival could be cut short. But nature lovers need not worry. They could, instead, spare a thought for Diego's colleague at the breeding program, known by the nondescript moniker, E5. According to gene tests, the less flamboyant creature, who is also going into retirement, has fathered nearly twice as many giant tortoises as Diego. Species survival, indeed the domain of evolution, is not always about charisma. For every Darwin there is a less celebrated Alfred Russel Wallace, for every Diego, there is an E5. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. 0 comments asterisk. The moderation of comments is automated and not cleared manually by IndianExpress.com. Talking of Kashmir, on China raising Kashmir issue again at UNSC, The Hindu. For the second time since the government's decision on Article 370 in August last year, China raised the issue of Kashmir at the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, on Wednesday, prompting a protest from New Delhi. In its response, the government said that Beijing should refrain from bringing a bilateral issue into the UNSC, and accused China of working at Pakistan's behest. New Delhi's response also pointed to the overwhelming majority of Security Council members being opposed to the Chinese reference on conditions in Jammu and Kashmir, J&K, which resulted in a lack of consensus for any kind of statement at the end of the meeting. India's case rests on the 1972 Shimla Accord, where India and Pakistan agreed to resolve the Kashmir issue bilaterally. China's repeated raising of Kashmir since last August, which includes an aborted attempt in December, is unconstructive and will impact the India-China bilateral relationship if it continues. It is also unlikely to push the government, which has already defied several international calls from friendly countries, into lifting restrictions or rolling back its measures in Kashmir. Given that New Delhi has refrained from raising similar issues over Tibet, Xinjiang or Hong Kong, it is unfair on the part of Beijing to take its concerns to the international stage, especially since President Xi Jinping didn't officially raise such concerns while visiting India in October. While China's move may be unwarranted, it is yet another reason for New Delhi to take heed of the continuing and unprecedented criticism of its actions in Kashmir. Prior to August, the last time Kashmir was raised at the UNSC format was in 1971. It has since been raised twice within a period of 5 months. China may have found no takers for a statement, but the fact that it was allowed to raise the issue at the UNSC cannot be brushed away. Nor can India maintain the duality of insisting, on the one hand, that Kashmir is a bilateral issue and, on the other hand, rejecting all bilateral talks with Pakistan. At some point, the government must push for normalization of ties with Pakistan as well as for the lifting of restrictions in Jammu and Kashmir. In the past few days, it seems the government has decided to review some of its decisions taken in August. It has released political prisoners and restored 2G connectivity to select places. It has also taken one group of envoys to Srinagar and Jammu, and is making plans for 36 cabinet ministers, who have not visited the region yet, to travel there. These measures, however, must not come in dribs and drabs, but must be comprehensive. Only when all communications are restored, all political prisoners freed and added security restrictions removed can the real task of healing in J&K even begin. One cup too many, on bid to merge ATP, Davis Cup, The Hindu. The inaugural ATP Cup ended on Sunday in Sydney with Novak Djokovic-led Serbia defeating Rafael Nadal-led Spain. The new, ambitious 24-country team tournament was considered a resounding success, for it attracted nearly all of the world's best, except Roger Federer, and culminated in a heavyweight final. That Nadal, the world's best male player, took on Djokovic, the number 2, in the summit clash just about set the perfect tone for the season's first major, the Australian Open, which starts next Monday. But for all the on-court highs, serious questions have been raised about the competition's viability in an already crowded tennis calendar. It was only last November that the Davis Cup, steeped in history, came out of a time warp and morphed into a similar one-week, 18-team, single-venue competition. Two such events within 6 weeks of each other will lead to a huge incursion into the players' off-season and can cause spectator fatigue. This was echoed by none other than Nadal and Djokovic, who played their hearts out at both the Davis Cup and the ATP Cup, and yet called for the two marquee tournaments to merge. The root of the problem lies in the fact that tennis suffers from a multitude of governing bodies that do not see eye to eye. The Association of Tennis Professionals (ATP), which controls men's tennis and also the official men's rankings, is the brain behind the ATP Cup and thus decided to award important ranking points for the event. The Davis Cup, run by the International Tennis Federation (ITF), does not have that luxury. In fact, awarding ranking points for such team events is inherently flawed, for it doesn't provide a level playing field. Andrei Rublev, ranked number 18, didn't make the Russian team for the ATP Cup because Daniil Medvedev and Karen Khachanov were ranked higher. But Greece's Mikhail Prevolorakis, ranked 483, featured because he was the country's next best player after Stefanos Tsitsipas. The flagship tournament has also had negative consequences for India. The coveted start of the season slot, which was earlier reserved for 3 ATP 250-level tournaments in Brisbane, Doha and Pune, is now the ATP Cups. Brisbane is one of the venues for the ATP Cup and such is Doha's monetary heft that it can still attract players. But Pune has had to push its dates by a month and, unlike in recent times, stares at the prospect of not featuring a single top 20 player. The spirit of tennis has for long been overwhelmingly global. But with top players increasingly ready to embrace events that pit nation against nation, there is no shortage of nationalistic fervor. It is this sentiment that the ATP Cup is seeking to tap into. But sans any clear vision, it is sure to turn into an overkill. Crime and Impunity, The Indian Express. Published, January 17, 2024, hours 8 minutes and 24 seconds am. The sports ministry, under which the SAI functions, cannot escape the blame. A pay reduction of 910 rupees per month was the penalty a Sports Authority of India (SAI) coach paid for being found guilty of sexual harassment, according to an RTI response sought by the Indian Express. Denying increments for a year was as harsh as it got for a few other offenders who sexually abused young athletes left in their care and guardianship at residential sports camps that churn out athletes, many of whom go on to represent India. The report in this paper about 45 complaints of sexual harassment, most of them against coaches by minor girls, has exposed a disconcerting truth. Sports isn't, as it is generally believed to be, just a celebration of exemplary resilience, strong self-belief and feel-good Cinderella stories. It has an ugly side, too. And this isn't a case of a few bad apples, but a systemic failure in protecting the country's hand-picked sporting stars when they were most vulnerable, away from home, dealing with the complications of a transitional age. The sports ministry, under which the SAI functions, cannot escape the blame. It has been found to be too lenient on those who have inflicted lifelong psychological trauma on proven match winners with exemplary athletic prowess and unflinching on-court temperament. These cases also bring into focus the lack of strict security protocols at these year-long camps. Since these are places where offenders are toughest to corner given the sheer nature of physical engagement between ward and coach, the SI needs more eyes and sensitive ears. Things are far from perfect at these sports campuses. While there's a strict code of conduct for players, there are no do's and don'ts for the coaches. Long dragging inquiries and some dodgy acquittals have triggered talk of the SI being more concerned about its image than the victims. Current provisions of law and the absence of a central registry that lists such predators means that predatory coaches could be repeating their crimes at other establishments, private schools and academies. The crime and the impunity leads to many athletes staying silent, even giving up on their sporting dream. Most girls come from humble backgrounds and can be persuaded or compelled to change their statements or take back their complaints. For many, their future in sports, a way out of poverty, is in the hands of the same coaches who prey on them. This injustice should rattle the conscience of sports lovers who will start demanding Olympic medals this leap year without sparing a thought for the abusive systems where the athletes learn to give up without a fight very early in life. Ministers in Valley, the Indian Express. Published, January 17, 2024 hours 11 minutes and 52 seconds am. An election will have to be called sooner than later and the BJP is clearly getting its ducks in a row. Since August 5, when the government removed Jammu and Kashmir's special status and downgraded it to a union territory, the people of the erstwhile state, especially in the valley, have been cut off by an internet ban that has been relaxed just a little, and curfew-like conditions, because of restrictions imposed by the government and partly due to civil disobedience. Against this backdrop, the planned outreach by the government to J&K through a team of 36 ministers who will visit it this week, appears to be in line with the thinking of the country's political leadership that a new normal has been established and accepted, and that the time is now ripe to assert this. 5 ministers in this team will focus only on meeting representatives of the public in the valley with the aim of disseminating to the information about the government's policies for the newly created UT. The outreach, oddly scheduled when snowfall has caused disruptions on top of the absence of communication, may indicate the hurry in the government to start unrolling its plans for J&K. An election will have to be called sooner than later and the BJP is clearly getting its ducks in a row. If there is a message here, it is this: the center will make all the decisions and impose them, and the people of J&K, or their politicians, must not be allowed any agency. This message is not new, it has been underlined by successive regimes at the center. But this time, it is being rubbed in even more harshly. The top political leaders of J&K remain in detention and cut off from the rest of the country by the continuing ban on free communication. The people have no access to information from a plurality of sources to make informed decisions, or even put forth their opinions to the visiting ministers. It is unjust that the government can send senior functionaries to J&K to meet and interact with people, even as 3 former chief ministers, and a host of other leaders, are locked up and unable to engage in any political activity. It is disingenuous of the government to claim normalcy and take delegations of diplomats to drive this home, but prevent opposition leaders from visiting Kashmir. If the aim behind removing special status, as the government claimed on August 5, is to integrate J&K with India, it is questionable this will be achieved by sending ministers to inform them of the decisions the center has taken on their behalf without involving them. Song Sung True, The Indian Express. Published, January 17, 2020 12 hours 32 minutes and 1 Fighting Radicalization, on CD's Bipin Rawat's comments, The Hindu. Chief of Defense Staff CD's General Bipin Rawat has a curious habit of saying things that raise the hackles of those who are concerned about military propriety and also officers in uniform speaking about civilian matters. Addressing a panel on countering terrorism at the Raisina Dialogue organized by the Ministry of External Affairs and Observer Research Foundation at New Delhi, he argued that there has been a significant increase in radicalization among young people in Kashmir, girls and boys as young as 10 to 12, included. He suggested that youth should be isolated from radicalization in a gradual way, and to be taken out separately and possibly taken into some deradicalization camps. He also revealed that such camps existed in the country. There is no doubt that radicalization must be countered at all levels, whether in Kashmir or elsewhere. But the government should reveal the nature of these camps that the CD's claims are functioning as they raise questions about their legal status and the identity of the youth there. In the last few years, there has been a rise in protests and violence in the Kashmir Valley, besides disaffection that has peaked following the abrogation of Jammu and Kashmir's special status and its conversion into a union territory. This is unlike a decade ago, when terrorism and violence had reduced drastically when compared to the 1990s, and there was a spurt in participation in democratic processes, besides a gradual diminishing of the valley's radical voice. Today, however, with political representatives, this includes those from among the mainstream polity, either facing curbs or under detention, the ground has become fertile for the revival of radicalism, which has been expressed either as a shrill form of separatism or invoked as extremist Islamist ideology. However, while deradicalization is certainly an imperative, Gen. Rawat's solution is way off the mark. Segregation of youth and individuals from family and community, many could be juveniles, is a recipe for further alienation and public revulsion and also plainly illegal. It is not the job of the army or security forces to undertake what is a mandate for the agencies of the civilian state. Deradicalization is best achieved through effective teaching and incorporation of civic studies in the school curriculum for children who are getting radicalized due to the prevailing circumstances in the valley. Besides this, there has to be an administrative outreach to the citizenry not to give in to radical demands and the rhetoric of extremists. More importantly, the reversal of repressive conditions such as limited net access and the detention of political representatives is a must. Winning Kashmiri hearts and minds is a long battle. Short-sighted and illiberal measures from an authoritarian playbook could prove counterproductive. Quiet, for now, on trade deal between U.S. and China, The Hindu. The Phase 1 trade deal U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He signed on Wednesday is but a temporary truce that leaves the key issues of the trade dispute unresolved. The pact that Mr. Trump has touted as a step toward creating a fairer and reciprocal partnership still leaves intact nearly 3/4 of punitive tariffs slapped on China since the onset of the trade rift in 2017. Even so, the limited terms the two largest economies agreed upon sets the political stage for further bilateral negotiations and to stem a further deterioration in the global growth scenario. China is to buy $200 billion in goods and services in the coming 2 years. Purchases in 2017 were valued at some $187 billion. The proposed increase in exports is believed to be unprecedented in U.S. trade history and caused speculation on the impact these steep targets could have on China's other trading partners. Agricultural exports form the smallest proportion of the latest offers relative to manufactured goods and services. This has been an important area of concern for the American farming sector ever since China imposed retaliatory tariffs on soybean imports from the U.S. But Beijing has promised to open its markets in dairy products, poultry, fish and allied sectors. Whereas China has given assurances to remove barriers for American banking, insurance and other financial services, Washington would be more wary of guarantees on IP protection and alleged forced technology transfers. The last two have been among the more contentious aspects of the trade dispute, as seen in the attacks on Chinese telecom manufacturer Huawei. Separately, Washington has invoked provisions on threats to its national security to punish adversaries, an exceptional measure in the international trading arena. Crucially, the timing of the package enables Mr. Trump to claim some success in narrowing the trade deficit with China ahead of his November re-election bid. Mr. Trump has said that negotiations on a Phase 2 agreement would begin immediately and even hinted that he could travel to Beijing. However, questions over government control of China's state-owned firms and industrial subsidies, at the core of the bilateral dispute, are not expected to be resolved until after the 2020 U.S. presidential elections. In parallel is the agreement to revive an erstwhile Obama-era mechanism for economic dialogue that was abandoned under the Trump administration. The step signals hope just as Washington's decision this week to withdraw the tag of a currency manipulator upon Beijing, accusing it of artificially devaluing the renminbi to gain competitive advantage. The new forum could set the tone to address sensitive issues that have dogged Beijing's relations with the U.S. and its allies after China joined the WTO. Seize the summit, the Indian Express. Published, January 18, 2024 hours 3 minutes and 8 seconds am. The summit will assume significance should Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan accept the invitation. On the face of it, Delhi's announcement that it will invite all heads of government of Shanghai Cooperation Organization member countries, including Pakistan, when India hosts the summit later this year, is not extraordinary. The host does not have the luxury of picking and choosing between members. But the summit will assume significance should Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan accept the invitation, as it will be the first by a head of government or state of that country to India since former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif attended the swearing-in ceremony of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2014. The hope of that visit was belied. In these 6 years, indeed in the 12 years since the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks, India and Pakistan have just about managed to tread water in their relations, keeping their diplomatic engagement from sinking. Sporadic attempts to engage failed, including at a previous SCO summit at Ufa in 2015. The last year has seen relations nosedive from their already low levels. First, there was the February 2019 Pulwama attack, India's Balakot response, and Pakistan's counter-response. Since August, after India did away with Jammu and Kashmir's special status, India and Pakistan have downgraded even their diplomatic presence in each other's countries, by withdrawing the High Commissioners. A war of words is now the only engagement between the two countries. Bilateral trade, which had managed to survive earlier shocks to relations, has stopped completely. That the opening of the Kartarpur corridor took place in this setting was miraculous, but that too was touch and go. Now the SCO presents an opportunity for a bilateral meeting on the sidelines between India and Pakistan. In deciding whether to accept the invitation, the Pakistan PM will have to take into consideration inputs of all stakeholders. A polite way of saying that the final yes or no will rest with the Pakistan Army. General Qamar Javed Bajwa appears to have pushed back dissenters in the army, but his continuance beyond the court-stipulated 6 months is still up in the air. Even if Imran Khan stays away and sends a minister instead, as India does routinely, however, it would still be a chance for a high-level bilateral meeting. Such a meeting may not lead to anything. The Ufa meeting produced a joint declaration, but Sharif had to walk back from it. Such meetings also become the focus of speculation cloaked in the new nationalism, which turns them into who won the match events, almost setting them up for failure. But the hiatus in ties cannot endure. The world wants India and Pakistan to engage, and this was evident in the way the UNSC refused to take up the Kashmir issue, saying it was not the forum for it. India, which has declared several times recently that it wants to peel away from historical foreign policy baggage, should make a start with Pakistan by making it possible for such a meeting to take place, or make it easier for the Pakistan Prime Minister to accept the invitation. A start could be made by resuming trade, which has ground to a dead halt, and by sending India's High Commissioner back to his office in Islamabad. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. 0 comments *.